The power went out in the middle of my Sunday night football game, and I figured it was just a fuse. But when I flipped the breakers, nothing. My internet and landline were dead too. That's when I knew something was off. I'm Quentin Wallace. I'm not the kind of guy who gets paranoid easily, but I've been tangling with the HOA for months, especially with their president, Edith Elwood. She's the kind of woman who marches around with a clipboard like it's a weapon and treats street parking like a federal offense. I've been pretty vocal in HOA meetings lately, pointing out how funds were being misused and rules were being, let's say, creatively enforced. So when my wife, Elara, came storming in from the front porch holding a pair of snipped phone wires in her hand, I wasn't even surprised. They cut them, cue. Someone actually cut our lines. Clean through. I took the wires in my hand and stared. You sure it wasn't a squirrel or something? No squirrel uses garden shears, she said, holding up the discarded tool she found behind our hedge. It still had a sticker from the HOA maintenance shed. That's when it clicked. At the last HOA meeting, I'd announced I was gathering signatures to audit the HOA's books since our community improvement fund somehow paid for a new golf cart for Edith and a fountain that's been leaking since week 1. Edith had looked at me like I'd just spit in her coffee. You're misinformed, Quentin, she'd snapped. Your little campaign is disruptive. You're spreading falsehoods. Apparently, trying to get transparency was now a crime. I wasn't about to let this go. I went to the garage, dusted off the motion sensor camera I used when raccoons used to raid our trash cans, and mounted it behind a tree facing the side of the house. Then I ran a fresh phone line through the back window and set up a voice recorder near it. Elara raised an eyebrow. You think they'll come back? I'm counting on it. 3 nights later, I caught her. Not just anyone her. Edith freaking Elwood. Right there on camera, in her floral nightgown and pink slippers, crouched behind my hydrangeas with a pair of wire cutters. She snipped the line, then leaned toward the flower bed and whispered, not realizing my recorder was picking up every word. That should shut him up for good. No more calls to the county. No more meetings. Quentin Wallace is done sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. I stood frozen in my kitchen, watching the footage play back at 2 in the morning. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from excitement. We had her. Elara stood over my shoulder. Please tell me you're going to do something with that. Oh, I'm doing more than something, I said. I'm taking this to the HOA board. And then to the sheriff if they don't act. She placed a hand on my shoulder. You think the board's gonna help? They're all scared of her. Then it's time they learned who's actually in charge around here. I burned a copy of the footage onto a flash drive, printed out stills, and stapled it to a formal complaint. Then I slid it into every mailbox on the block. By breakfast, the neighborhood was buzzing and Edith Elwood had no idea what was coming. By mid-morning, I could hear the storm brewing from 3 houses down. Old Mr. Hannigan, who hadn't left his porch in over a year, was pacing up and down his walkway, waving the printed stills in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. Across the street, Maribel, who usually kept to herself unless someone's dog stepped on her lawn, was on the phone with someone, her voice pitched and furious. Even the Becker twins, who were usually too busy with their landscaping business to care about neighborhood drama, had paused their leaf blowers to stare at the growing cluster of neighbors outside Edith's house. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and waited. Elara joined me, arms crossed. She hasn't come out yet? Not a peep. But she saw the mail. Her blinds twitched around 7. That's when the door opened. Edith shuffled out like she was headed for a funeral, oversized sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, and a silk scarf tied tightly under her chin. She clutched a manila envelope and headed straight down the walkway toward her golf cart, her precious HOA-funded chariot. I stepped off my porch casually and called out, Morning, Edith. Lovely day to answer for a felony, isn't it? She froze mid-step. Don't flatter yourself, Quentin. This is slander. You've manipulated images to stir up chaos. That's a fancy accusation. You plan to explain it to the sheriff the same way. She turned, voice taut. The board will handle this internally. No, they won't. Because I already filed a police report. Gave them the original footage and audio. You trespassed, tampered with communication lines, and conspired to obstruct a community audit. That's not board business. That's criminal. A black SUV rolled up the street just in time to punctuate the moment. Not some HOA security contractor, this was county law enforcement. The deputy stepped out, adjusted his belt, and walked up to Edith. Ma'am, I'm Deputy Langford. We need to speak with you about an incident involving property damage and unlawful surveillance interference. Her voice cracked. This is a mistake. I'm the president of this HOA. Langford didn't blink. And I'm here on behalf of the state. Please come with me. He didn't cuff her right away. He let her climb into the back of the vehicle with some dignity, but the silence that followed was heavier than any siren. As the SUV turned the corner, the neighbors turned to me. You really did it, Maribel said. You caught her. I nodded. She caught herself. I just put it where everyone could see it. Hannigan stepped forward. You think the rest of the board knew? I think some of them suspected and kept their mouths shut. But now they'll have to speak up, especially when the county starts looking at the HOA books. What do we do in the meantime? Asked one of the Becker twins. We fill those empty seats. Legally. Transparently. And we do it fast. By the time lunch rolled around, I had already drafted a petition to call an emergency election. I printed out copies, handed them off to anyone willing to take a street, and by the afternoon, we had more than enough signatures to force a vote. But that wasn't the end. At 4:30, a knock rattled my front door. This time, it wasn't a neighbor or a deputy. It was a man in a navy suit, clipboard in hand. He introduced himself as Alan Trenton, a compliance investigator from the State Office of Homeowners Association Oversight. The county sheriff's office had forwarded the footage and complaint to their department. We're opening a preliminary investigation into the HOA's financial practices. If what's in this footage is accurate, it's likely part of a wider pattern of abuse, he said. Elara leaned against the doorway. You think it goes beyond phone lines? We've seen this before, Trenton said, flipping through his notes. Presidents like Elwood use intimidation to silence dissent. But tampering with utilities? That's federal territory. And if HOA funds were used to do it, they were, I said. The shears she used came from the HOA maintenance shed. Then it's no longer just her problem, he replied. It's the board's. Within the week, subpoenas went out to the treasurer and vice president. Bank statements were requested. HOA meeting transcripts were pulled. And more residents came forward with small stories that, until now, they've been too frustrated or afraid to mention mysterious fines after speaking up, denied maintenance requests that magically cleared once a donation was made, and plenty of lost emails. I watched the board unravel from my front porch. The vice president, a man named Gerald who'd always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, resigned 2 days later. The treasurer, Sharon, tried to claim ignorance but folded when investigators found checks signed with her name that funded community events that never happened. The emergency election happened the following weekend. We held it in the park, not in the community center, to avoid any tampering. I didn't run. I didn't need to. I nominated Elara, and she won in a landslide. Alongside her, we elected Maribel, Mr. Hannigan's niece, a tax consultant, and one of the Becker twins, Liam, who turned out to have an MBA and zero patience for nonsense. That night, Elara sat at our dining table, sorting through the first stack of HOA financial records we'd forced the outgoing board to turn over. Do you think she'll do jail time? She asked, flipping through a receipt labeled security enhancement that was clearly for Edith's golf cart stereo system. She cut federal lines, trespassed, and used HOA resources to do it, I said. She's not walking away with a fine and a warning. She'll lie. She'll say she didn't understand, that it was a mistake. Doesn't matter. The footage shows intent. She whispered her plan to the flower bed, Elara. I don't think the flower bed's accepting apologies. She laughed, the kind of laugh that only comes after weeks of stress finally release. I still can't believe she did it herself. Didn't send someone else? People like her think they're invincible. That rules don't apply when you're in charge. Not anymore, she said, pulling out a ledger with a red tab stuck to the side. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. Peaceful. For once, no one was checking the length of my grass or measuring the angle of my trash bins. Just before bed, I stepped outside and looked toward Edith's house. A realtor's sign had gone up in the yard. She was gone, not just from the board, but from the neighborhood. And for the first time in months, our phones worked just fine. The week after the election, the neighborhood felt different. Not just quieter, but clearer, like someone had finally opened the windows after years of stale air. The HOA meetings were now held outside under the old pavilion in Ridgeview Park. No more locked doors. No more agendas printed in size 8 font with half the items deferred. For the first time in a long while, people actually showed up willingly. Elara handled her new position like she'd been waiting her whole life for it. She delegated smartly, asked the right questions, and refused to let anyone speak in circles. Maribel took over communications, and within days, we had a clean digital archive of every policy, every fee, every document the previous board claimed had been misplaced during transition. Hannigan's niece, Rebecca, dove straight into the financials. She found a lot. The first thing she uncovered was a string of payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist. According to the invoices, they'd been maintaining the entrance signs, trimming hedges, and reseeding the park lawn every month. But the county records showed those services had been handled by the Parks Department for free since the neighborhood signed a joint maintenance agreement 5 years ago. Rebecca didn't just raise an eyebrow, she called the State Office of HOA Oversight directly. "I'm looking at 5 years' worth of double billing," she told them. Funds were being siphoned into a shell company, and I just pulled the business registration. It was filed under a fake name using a P.O. box out in Crest Hollow. The investigator on the other end didn't need convincing. A fraud case had already been opened against Edith for the phone line incident. This new angle turned it into a full-blown corruption probe. 2 days later, a state forensic accounting team showed up in our neighborhood with clipboards, scanners, and a search warrant. They started with the HOA's storage unit, the one Edith had kept the key to herself. It sat on the edge of the neighborhood by the tennis courts, a beige metal cube with a rusted padlock and no windows. When they cracked it open, what they found wasn't just gardening tools and holiday decorations. There were boxes of receipts, handwritten logs, envelopes of petty cash, and an entire filing cabinet with 2 drawers labeled Community Projects Do Not Remove. By the end of the day, the lead investigator, Trenton, returned to our house. "You were right to pursue this," he said, setting a folder on our dining table. "We've got enough here for felony embezzlement, obstruction, and wire fraud. And that's just what we've confirmed so far." Elara leaned forward. "So what happens now?" "She's getting indicted," Trenton said. "Formally. The state attorney's pushing for prosecution. And she's not the only one. We're looking at Sharon too. The treasurer signed off on every one of these." I looked at the folder. Inside were scanned checks, copies of wire transfers, and notes in Edith's own handwriting. One memo simply said, "Delay audit until after renewal. Transfer excess to Crest Hollow ACCT. Do not mention to Gerald." Trenton tapped the page. "This isn't just bad bookkeeping. It's a deliberate scheme to launder HOA funds. We're talking hundreds of thousands over several years." Elara sat back in her chair. "Did any of it go to the community at all?" "Some. Enough to cover up the rest. That's how these schemes stay hidden. Throw a bone to the neighborhood, then pocket the rest through ghost vendors and fake repairs." We watched as the forensic team packed the last of the files into evidence boxes. A patrol car rolled up to Edith's former house, where her son had been staying since she left. He opened the door, took one look at the paperwork, and said something no one expected. "She told me to burn the rest." Trenton turned sharply. "Excuse me." She called from her sister's place in Tennessee. Said to get rid of everything in the upstairs closet. But I didn't. I didn't want to get involved. The officers followed him upstairs and emerged 10 minutes later with a fireproof lockbox, a laptop, and a manila folder labeled Dues Adjustments Private. Inside were a list of names, amounts, and what looked like notes about who could be pressured with overdue fines. One note stood out. It said, "Wallace neutralize. Block communications. Monitor behavior. Escalate if necessary." The officer holding the folder looked at me. "You were a target." "I figured that out when she clipped my phone line," I said. "No," he said, flipping the folder open again. "This note is dated 6 weeks before that. They've been talking about you long before the audit push." That was the moment it all shifted. What Edith had done wasn't just reactive, it had been part of a long-term plan to control dissent and consolidate power. She hadn't panicked. She'd been executing. Within 48 hours, she was arrested at her sister's house and extradited back to the state. Sharon turned herself in the next day. The trial was scheduled for early fall, but the local news got wind of the story long before that. A journalist from Channel 7 showed up at the next HOA meeting with a camera crew. Elara didn't flinch. She answered every question, laid out every reform, and handed over a redacted copy of the audit findings without being asked. The headline that aired that night was brutal: HOA president charged with fraud, sabotage local residents' clean house. But what hit hardest was the footage they aired next to side by side of Edith cutting the phone line. In the very next frame, her being led out of her sister's house in handcuffs. At the next HOA meeting, a woman I'd never seen before raised her hand. She introduced herself as Naomi Green, a nurse who'd moved in just before the chaos started. "I just want to say thank you," she said. "I almost sold my house. I thought this place was cursed. But now it feels like a community again." After the meeting, Elara and I walked home in the dark, the crunch of gravel under our shoes the only sound. "Think they'll convict her?" she asked. "They've got enough to make it stick 3 times over," I said. And the judge already denied bail. Hard to believe someone could go that far just to keep a grip on a neighborhood. It was never about the neighborhood. It was about control. She liked being feared. She underestimated what happens when people stop being afraid. That night, I pulled the old security camera down from the tree. We didn't need it anymore. Not because the world had become safe, but because people had finally started watching out for each other instead of watching their backs. And for the first time in years, the only thing I heard through the phone line was a dial tone. Not a threat, not a snip, just the sound of things working the way they should. 2 months after Edith's arrest, the courtroom was packed. The trial had been moved downtown to accommodate the press. It wasn't just a local matter anymore. A story about a suburban HOA president orchestrating sabotage and fraud had caught the attention of state-level reporters, even a few national ones. They called it the Garden Shears case, and headlines a ridiculous name, but fitting in its absurdity. Elara and I sat near the front, behind the prosecution's table. She had a legal pad in her lap, not because she needed to take notes, but because she wanted to. Ever since she stepped up as the new HOA president, she'd taken every opportunity to make sure no one ever got to hide behind a title again. The courtroom doors opened, and Edith shuffled in with her court-appointed attorney. She looked smaller than I remembered, and not just because she'd cut her hair. It was the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands twitched in her lap every time someone whispered from the gallery. Her usual floral prints were gone, replaced by a stiff beige suit that didn't fit quite right. The prosecution opened with the footage. The judge allowed it without much debate. They showed the clip of her sneaking through our yard, snipping the lines, then whispering her intentions to nobody in particular. You could feel the room tighten with every word she'd spoken on that recording. Then they moved to the financial records. Rebecca had been subpoenaed to testify. She brought the receipts literally. One by one, she laid out the checks made to fake contractors, the inflated invoices, the personal purchases disguised as maintenance costs. The prosecution tied it all back to Edith and Sharon with bank records, email logs, and even a signed letter authorizing a payment for emergency pest control that turned out to be a catered dinner for a board retreat at a private spa. When it was my turn to testify, I told them exactly what happened, how the phone lines were cut, how we found the shears, how we caught it all on camera. No embellishments, just facts. The defense tried to argue it was a misunderstanding, that maybe someone else had used the shears, that maybe she was doing yard work at night. The jury didn't buy it. They weren't stupid. The turning point came when the state's forensic accountant took the stand. He'd traced the fake vendors back to a trail of dummy corporations, all linked to a single business registration in Crest Hollow. The name on the paperwork? Edith's cousin, an ex-con with a history of filing fraudulent tax returns. The prosecutor paused, then asked the accountant if he could summarize the extent of the theft. He nodded. Over the course of 5 years, approximately $267,000 were siphoned from HOA funds into these shell accounts. The majority of those funds were then withdrawn in cash or used to purchase personal items unrelated to HOA business. The courtroom went quiet. Not even the reporters typed. When the jury returned the next day, they didn't take long. Guilty on all counts: wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, destruction of utility infrastructure, and obstruction of community governance. Sharon pled out the week before, testifying in exchange for a reduced sentence. Edith hadn't been offered a deal. The state wanted an example made. The judge didn't hesitate. "This case reflects a grotesque abuse of authority," he said. "You manipulated a position of trust to enrich yourself, endangered residents by tampering with utilities, and used fear to maintain control. You will serve 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat there, staring at the floor, as the bailiff placed cuffs on her wrists and led her out the side exit. Outside, the reporters swarmed, but I kept walking. Elara caught up to me by the courthouse steps. "That's it then. For her," I said. "But not for us. Back in our neighborhood, the cleanup wasn't over. The audit had unearthed more than fraud. It had exposed vulnerabilities in how the HOA operated. The bylaws hadn't been updated in over 10 years. The voting procedures were a mess. Records were kept in paper folders stacked in someone's garage. So we rewrote it all. Every clause, every policy, every fine schedule. We held community workshops. Residents made suggestions, voted on changes, and everything was documented and posted online. Transparency stopped being a buzzword and started being a practice. At one of the final workshops, a contractor named Luis stood up. He'd lived in the neighborhood for almost a decade but never attended a single meeting before. I used to just pay the dues and pray no one noticed my truck parked outside too long, he said. No? I actually care what happens here. You made it feel like ours again. Elara nodded. That's the point. It was never supposed to be about control. It's about community. The fountain that Edith had insisted on keeping despite its endless leaks was torn out and replaced with a native plant garden. The HOA golf cart was sold, and the funds were redirected to install proper lighting along the walking path. And the old storage unit? We donated it to a local youth sports league after clearing it out. In the fall, the county recognized Ridgeview Hollow as a model for HOA reform. They sent out a team to document the process and used it to build a pilot program for other neighborhoods dealing with similar issues. One evening, as the last of the summer heat faded, Elara and I stood in the park watching a group of neighborhood kids chase each other between the new raised garden beds. Remember when we thought we'd have to move? She asked. I nodded. Back when the biggest problem we had was a blocked phone line. She looked at me sideways. You mean a targeted, premeditated act of sabotage? Sure. That too. She laughed, a real laugh this time, not one laced with exhaustion or stress. Thing is, if she hadn't gone that far, we might never have caught everything else. Yeah, I said. She tried to shut us up, and gave us the exact proof we needed to expose her instead. A car pulled up at the curb. Maribel stepped out, holding a stack of flyers. Town hall meeting next week, she called out. And we're adding a dog park proposal to the agenda. Dog park? I raised an eyebrow. She grinned. Turns out, it's the one thing everyone agrees on. We stayed at the park until the sun dipped below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the grass. The air felt clean, not just from the breeze, but from the absence of fear. No one was measuring fences. No one was lurking behind blinds. No one was whispering about who was on whose side. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were a community. And Edith Elwood? She was nothing more than a cautionary tale.